reference this or to preview previous RSSL office hours, they're also available on our website. So we have a lot to cover today, and I'll ask for you're welcome to use the chat for questions, but know that we have worked, Shantine was up until midnight last night working really hard on some FAQ questions that were generated as a result of some engagements that we had on Friday around this topic. So after I do a high-level overview, we will have a series of slides that attempt to offer some FAQs. So we certainly don't want to suppress any of your questions, but we think that by the end of our presentation, we likely will have addressed many of them. So we'll work through them one by one and hopefully help to clarify quite a bit of information. All right, so some big ideas around the 2-week freeze. The governor's announcement reflects a real critical effort to help save lives and flatten the COVID curve. We know that there are, we're breaking records in terms of numbers of COVID cases in Oregon, and this is really a response to public health measure. And we know that our hospitals are overwhelmed. My sister's an ICU nurse in the Portland metro area. I know many of you likely have families and friends that are first responders in the health field. And we know that part of this 2-week freeze is an effort to ensure that our hospitals have capacity to help people who are sick with COVID and other ailments. So we want to be responsive to that. And again, as I said earlier, we're in a dangerous situation that requires intervening. Other states are doing the same, as you likely read over the weekend, New Mexico and Washington. And of course, being indoors in the winter and other virus spread certainly is compounding things. Next slide. So while there is some implication for K-2 schools, it's important to know that K-12 schools are not directly impacted by the 2-week freeze. So congregate homeless sheltering, youth programs, childcare, K-12 schools, K-12 sports, D1 athletics, and higher ed operate under sector-specific guidance for all risk levels. So we'll go through and unpack a little bit more about what this means. So included in the governor's announcement on Friday was a travel advisory. And again, our FAQ will address this because we know you have lots of questions about what does this mean for staffing and for students. So we'll address that at the end. But essentially wanted to highlight what this travel advisory names. So for anybody arriving in Oregon from another state or country, including returning Oregon residents, should practice self-quarantine for 14 days after arrival and should limit interactions to and with their immediate household. And of course, non-essential travel includes any travel that's considered tourism or recreational in nature. And essential travel is anything for work and study, critical infrastructure support, economic services, and supply chain, health, immediate medical care, and safety and security. My 8-year-old did try to make a very persuasive argument that seeing Ami and Papa for Thanksgiving was essential travel. So just want to lead with compassion and understanding about how this affects folks' traditions and family connections and other things of that important nature. So again, Oregonians are encouraged to stay home or in their region and avoid any non-essential travel to other states or country, which is again in response to peak COVID spread, and knowing that reducing travel also reduces the risk of virus transmission. Next slide, please. So there's a lot that schools can do to mitigate spread from travelers. So if you know as a school or system that families are traveling, you can help spread the word around the advisory so people hold awareness. You can also help support the 14-day quarantine yourselves, and among staff, you can encourage and strongly support the implementation of the quarantine for anyone for whom it applies. And it might be the case that you're unaware entirely of who's traveling in terms of staff or students, particularly if you're in CDL. So it makes it all the more important that we're really mindful of our entry and screening protocols. And you can find those in Ready Schools Safe Learners Section 1F. And the exclusion guide offers really important tools that can guide you in the next several weeks. And you can take a look at, I'm sure a colleague can drop that in the chat as well. So again, on Friday, the Governor Brown announced a statewide closure. It's in effect for 2 weeks, effective Wednesday, November 18th through Wednesday, December 2nd. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but that may be longer for certain counties, i.e. Multnomah County, where case counts are high. And data will be reviewed after 2 weeks, and at that point, the order may be continued. So this is just, next couple slides really are an overview around what does the governor's order pertain to. So in terms of social gatherings, both indoor or outdoor, the order outlines that there should be a maximum of 6 people in total and a limit of 2 households. Takeout only for eating and drinking establishments, and all gyms and fitness organizations will be closed. We know that indoor recreation, museums, indoor street fairs, standalone pools and sports courts will be closed, so they're prohibited under the governor's order. Grocery stores and pharmacies, a maximum of 75% capacity, and strong encouragement of curbside pickup when and where possible. Any other retail or farmers markets, indoor, outdoor street markets, indoor and outdoor malls, including state agency operations that serve the public, are to have a maximum of 75% of capacity, and again, encourage curbside pickup where practical or possible. For churches, longhouses, and other faith institutions or gatherings, there's a maximum of 25 people for indoor services and 50 people for outdoor services. And other venues, indoor and outdoor, are prohibited. For any offices, requiring remote work if possible and closing offices to the public. Zoos, gardens, aquariums, standalone pools, and sport courts will be closed. Personal services are allowed. What we're discovering and what transmission data is showing is that they are not a common source of transmission, so the risk there is low. Long-term care visits will be allowed outdoors only. In terms of outdoor recreation and sports, they will be allowed, and there will be forthcoming guidance put out this week by OSAA. Any indoor recreational sports will be prohibited, and again, guidance forthcoming this week. For public and private schools, continuing under current metrics and protocols using the RSSL guidance and the planning for COVID-19 scenarios. And we'll talk a little bit more again further on what that means for K-12. So there's some important ways that schools can really support mitigating COVID spread. One is to help spread the word again around the West Coast travel advisory, help talk about it, help model what that looks like. Governor Brown did a nice job on Friday talking specifically sounds like she's partaking in Thanksgiving and was naming what her tradition will then look like, and who will actually be part of that traditional meal that she'll be preparing. So, any way that we can lead by example and share personally ways that we're honoring the governor's executive order, I know that that's helpful in building shared practice and understanding. Of course, again, emphasizing the entry and screening protocols will be really critical, as well as helping to reinforce and remind people of the exclusion guide. Really helpful time to just remind people. I know you might feel like you've got you're a broken record at times, but you can never talk too much about the key practices for mitigating spread of COVID-19. So talking about physical distancing, the importance of hand hygiene, cohorting, protective equipment, i.e. face coverings, not shields, um, isolation and quarantine if there is risk of exposure, and cleaning, environmental awareness around what we're, how we're caring and tending to our environment, and then airflow and ventilation. So these are really important, helpful also to provide reassurance to students and community that you're doing these things and tending to these things in order to mitigate risk. Keep an eye out for K-12 athletics guidance. We know you're eager for that, and we're working on, folks are working on getting that out to you as soon as possible. To the extent that it's practical and allowable, consider work from home opportunities. Review your facility use agreements for other sector uses. That'll be really important if you rent out your school facility for any reason or purpose. And of course, if you've got questions and need support, attending the office hours like you're doing today, or using the COVID inbox is really helpful so that you can get any questions resolved and answered. And I would add to that, use each other, which I know you do beautifully already, but can't underscore enough how much of a resource schools and leaders are for one another during this time. So these are just some big final thoughts before we dive into some really specific Q&A. So given the data and modeling we're seeing, public health experts state that some counties like Multnomah will likely need a longer freeze than just 2 weeks. So accordingly, Multnomah County and other hotspots will stay in the freeze for at least 4 weeks, if not longer. So that's a really important thing to consider if you're living or leading in one of those counties. We also know that actions now really help prevent lives from being lost. So not just from COVID-19, but for other diseases or accidents that require a high level of medical intervention or hospital level care. So we want to make sure that there's capacity for those sorts of calamities and health needs in our system. We know that this action by Governor Brown is not the same as last spring. So it's not as significant as last spring. I think they looked for places where there could be more opportunity for some modicum of patterns of normal life, if you will. And again, I know it's cold, but we're Oregonians after all. So many of us are used to putting on rain boots and having long coats with hoods. So encouraging outdoor recreation as possible, whenever possible. Playgrounds and state parks will remain open toward that end. And again, changes to youth sports guidance was forthcoming, and no change at current guidance on Division I athletics. All right, so we've got lots of questions that we've been fielding. So here's a summary of a few of them to highlight that we hope are helpful for you. And again, we'll go through these. And if you have any questions that we aren't able to cover, we'll certainly pause and hold space for those. Before I start into these, Shantine or Alexa, are you seeing anything that we need to address before we start in on these questions?
I don't think so. I think we're taking them one at a time. Those we don't have the answer for, we're compiling them, and we meet with OHA twice a week. And so I've already got a list of 3 that are going to OHA. So we'll just keep engaging in the chat, and then maybe there will be fewer once you get through some of the questions that we gathered from the 5 convenings since Friday.
Perfect. Awesome. All right. And hopefully my pace is okay. Sometimes I can talk quickly. So I'm okay. All right. Don't feel free to let me know to slow down if I need to. So we're going to start by highlighting some questions related to the theme of what is the legal impact of the freeze. The first question is as follows: help us reconcile the apparent inconsistency between a statewide freeze and schools being allowed to continue to operate in person, which is a good question. So here's what we know. We know that schools all operate under Ready Schools, Safe Learners, which is sector-specific guidance that has been carefully crafted by OHA and ODE in careful consultation and collaboration. And we know that transmission of COVID-19 in schools can be limited because of all of the incredible detail in that guidance and the great work of all of you on these office hours that work so thoroughly and conscientiously if you're in hybrid or on site to ensure that these are followed. So we know that there's been limited spread in Oregon in schools, and because of our public health protocols related to K-12. And we also know that there's other places where there have been low transmission rates, i.e. personal service and salons and things of that nature. Those are also being allowed to open. So really what the freeze is attempting to do is to minimize activity where transmission rates are high. So because K-12 has done such a beautiful job of implementing the guidance and taking this seriously and have been able to really mitigate spread, K-12 has remained, of course, with the metrics guidance, but has been able to continue in operation. The next question says, how will the restrictions be monitored and enforced? And how will law enforcement be involved? So that's a little bit outside of our area of expertise, but what we do know is that breaking governor's emergency order is a Class C misdemeanor in Oregon. And there's also been some conversation around potentially the role of police if gatherings are happening in ways that are outside of the governor's order. So again, staying with the big theme of legal impact of the freeze, how can we legally mandate that staff who travel out of state and/or how do we require them to stay home? So here's what's really important to know: that school districts are not responsible for mandates related to travel or staying home. However, as Oregonians and/or people who work within Oregon, school district staff and students are subject to the authority of the governor's mandate in this regard. So it's just a notion of how we're stewards of this message and how we model it and how we encourage it in our local context. Another question was, will the new restrictions be authorized by executive order? So Governor Brown has indicated that she does intend to issue an executive order in order to make the limits on activities and gatherings legally binding. And OHA plans to issue specific guidance by sector in coming days. Next slide, please. So this question is, our district has made the decision that it's best for student learning when staff work on campus. Are schools required to have teachers working from home if possible? Short answer to that is no. Teachers are able to work on site, as is consistent and outlined within the operational blueprint for reentry. They are continued to be subject to all requirements in RSSL guidance, the companion guidance, and the supplemental guidance documents. However, districts should mandate work from home to the greatest extent possible, as is consistent with their selected instructional models. Ultimately, this is a district personnel decision, so a place where judgment and local control come to light in life. Question here that this is one of those that Shondine mentioned, we're still working with OHA to get a response to this, so no question yet. but wanted to honor and appreciate that people have asked whether school boards can meet in person as a public meeting and what the guidance is for local school board meetings during this time. So we're working on getting an answer, and that should be forthcoming. This question is, should our district office staff work on site at the office? So again, districts should mandate work from home to the greatest extent possible, as is consistent with their selected instructional model. If it is not essential to have staff on site and work can be performed from home, they should be advised to work from home for the duration of the freeze period. How about main offices? Should they be open and open to the public? And the question is, offices should be closed to the public and all non-essential visitors. Districts should mandate work from home to the greatest extent possible, as is consistent with their selected instructional models. Here's a question related to quarantine and isolation due to travel. Are schools subject to the travel self-quarantine requirement? If we have staff or students who travel out of Oregon, should we exclude them from being on site for 14 days? So what we're saying here is that everyone in Oregon is subject to the self-quarantine requirement, and it's expected that all students, staff, and community members comply with the requirements. Essentially, we have like it's just kind of tugging on our ethic of care for one another in this moment, to care for one another and everybody doing their part to minimize the spread of COVID-19 in order to save lives and ensure that our hospitals have capacity. It is important to note that post-travel requirement is self-quarantine. Schools are not expected to police the practice of self-quarantine, but should strongly encourage all students, staff, and community members to follow requirements. Again, from that vantage point of everyone has a responsibility to do their part. So another question about travel. What constitutes travel? Does it have to be overnight? And is there a specific mileage involved? Do the travel restrictions affect those coming into Oregon from Washington and California? So the first thing I want to make sure everybody knows is this is only for non-essential travel. So if your travel is for work and study, critical infrastructure support, economic services and supply chains, health, immediate medical care, safety and security, it's considered essential travel. So what we know is that the recent travel advisories issued by Washington, Oregon, and California urge against any non-essential out-of-state travel and ask people to self-quarantine for 14 days after arriving from another state or country and encourage residents to stay local. If you do not need to travel, you shouldn't. And there's more information in this link around specific travel requirements if helpful. Some more questions around travel. This seemed to be the hot topic of the announcement on Friday. How are staff who commute from another state impacted by the requirement to self-quarantine following interstate travel? So again, because this is essential travel, work and study are considered essential. Commuting to work across state lines does not require a self-quarantine. Staff who travel across state lines for work are still expected to avoid non-essential travel, and avoiding travel can reduce the risk of virus transmission. Somebody was wondering, is the 14-day quarantine for travel effective immediately or only during the specified freeze period? So the Oregon Travel Advisory was announced and made effective on 11/13/2020. There was a question around that, Shondine, and I don't know if you have the answer to that, because if that's the start date, what's the end date? Is it the same? Does it coincide, because the 2-week freeze starts on the 18th and goes, I think, through just, I can't remember, whatever 2 weeks from that is, I think the 2nd of December potentially. So the question that was asked, if this is effective on the Friday and not the Wednesday, is it longer than 2 weeks, or does it extend beyond 2 weeks? So I don't know. Do you know the answer to that?
If you travel and come back, you quarantine from 14 days from the day you return. So it's not about just being this window of the 2 week. This could be, here's our 2 week freeze. And if you tend to travel at the end of that 2 week freeze, you still have to quarantine post 14 days from that moment.
Right, but the 2-week freeze, like officially, is not supposed to start until the 18th and go until December 2nd. So if this travel advisory is in effect on the 13th, does it essentially, do you see my question?
I do. Let me think about
Okay.
that. And
Okay,
back at you.
thank you. Next slide. So more questions related to travel. Are we able to mandate staff exclusion due to travel? So again, everyone in Oregon is subject to the self-quarantine requirement, so that we're trying to help provide language that you can in turn use as well. It is expected that all students, staff, and community members comply with these requirements, and we have a duty to care for one another. It's also true that you're not expected to police these practices of self-quarantine. I think this is a repeat. Is it a repeat, or am I just tired and talking about this too much? Okay, it's a repeat. I think somehow we got 2 slides, my mistake. Um, 3 more questions around isolation due to travel. Do staff who are required to self-quarantine have to take leave? So here's where we're really saying work with legal counsel to determine protocols within your individual collective bargaining agreements. So districts may support work from home opportunities to the extent that's practical for your context and for your instructional model. And ideally, people who have to self-quarantine would be able to work from home for that period of time.
Yeah.
But again, up to local context, and that would be a local decision for folks to make. Do districts have to provide paid leave to staff who are required to self-quarantine due to travel? Again, this is a local determination subject to collective bargaining requirements. And finally, what about guests from out of state staying with staff and or students? Is that also part of the 14-day quarantine? And this is another question like the school board question that we're taking tomorrow to OHA for an answer. So we don't have an answer yet for this. Next slide. So this question is around, can self-quarantine requirements for staff impact the instructional model for a school? So in other words, if a significant number of staff are required to self-quarantine and you were in person, then what? So it is possible. But what we know is that instructional models are a local determination based on both the general metrics and exceptions and the district and school's ability to meet all applicable requirements. So if you were on site and the majority of your teachers participated in non-essential travel and had to quarantine for 14 days upon return, then it would likely prove true that you needed to do a CDL model and or secure substitutes in person during their self-quarantine time. So for any staffing considerations, including those that result from the need for self-quarantine, it may make it difficult again for districts to fully meet the requirements of RSSL in one instructional model, therefore triggering a need to shift to another instructional model. So a really important thing, therefore, to really talk again with staff about and help people really understand the full implication of the governor's announcement on Friday. Are there any exceptions to the need to self-quarantine following travel? And I saw some questions about this in the chat. In other words, what if a staff member got a negative COVID-19 test upon returning from travel? So people do not have to practice self-quarantine again if they're engaging in essential travel. And it is only for non-essential travel that self-quarantine pertains to. And I don't know that this specifically answers that, Shandine. I'm not sure about if somebody has a negative COVID test, are they exempt from the quarantine? So I'm not sure the answer to that.
I'm bringing that up to OHA. I already texted a couple epidemiologists. We'll get back to you on that one.
Thank you so much.
That would be a really good one to get an answer on soon.
Thank you. All right, next slide, please. So I've seen some questions about this in the chat. Lots of people wondering, what is the impact of the freeze on limited in-person instruction? So we have a couple of questions to help address that for folks. So how do these new requirements impact instruction within schools? So again, schools are subject to the requirements of sector-specific guidance, as you well know, through RSSL and its companion and supplemental guidance. So as long as you are following Ready School Safe Learners, there shouldn't be any direct implication for how you're providing instruction. Should a school that planned to implement limited in-person instruction but has not yet begun it proceed with the plan to begin limited in-person instruction? What is ODE's recommendation? So again, this is something that we strongly encourage you to make a decision in consultation with your LPHA, with your local public health authority, and based on local context. It certainly might be true that you might choose to consider to delay limited in-person instruction if you haven't yet begun it and you've got quite a bit of COVID spike and spread in your community. It could also be true that upon consultation with your LPHA and based on if you've got really limited to no spread of COVID, that you decide to move forward with offering limited in person. Next slide, please. So this relates again to, are we required to have staff work from home and consequently cancel in-person instruction? So again, this is a place where judgment, local decision making will come to play. And I've already talked with some of you, and I know that people are addressing this in different ways, in ways that feel most right and responsive to their context. So what we're saying is that districts should really support work from home opportunities to the extent that practical, but you do not need to cancel in-person instruction in order to accommodate working from home. So I'll repeat that. Districts do not need to cancel in-person instruction in order to accommodate working from home. It does remain as an option for you for schools to shift to comprehensive distance learning to support staff's ability to work from home, but it's not a requirement that ODE is making. So staff should be advised to work from home, again, to the greatest extent possible, as is consistent with the school's selected instructional models. And if it is not essential to have staff on site and their work can be performed from home or remotely, they should be advised to work from home for the duration of the freeze period. This is a question related to childcare and limited in person. If schools are providing childcare, they must also provide limited in-person instruction. If we choose to stop limited in-person instruction during the required freeze period, will we be able to continue providing childcare? So this question doesn't feel totally direct, or the answer doesn't feel very direct to me. So Shandine, if you have the answer, if anybody on the call does, please chime in. But essentially it says, the response here says that childcare falls under the guidance provided by Early Learning Division. So please check their website for more information. I'm thinking that the answer to that question is yes, you will be able to continue to provide childcare.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. This is another question related to limited in-person instruction. Are schools still able to provide limited in-person instruction during the required freeze period? So again, yes, schools may provide limited in-person instruction. It's all subject to the requirements of Ready School Safe Learners, the companion guidance and supplemental guidance in coordination with the advice of local public health authorities. So here's an important piece to consider. Schools should consider pausing limited in person when county rates climb over 200 cases per 100,000 and population in population in counties with populations greater than 30,000 or over more than 60 cases in counties with less than 30,000 residents. When considering closing to in-person instruction for schools that have opened under any one of the exceptions to the general metrics for reopening schools for in-person instruction, including the LIPI exception, schools should work with LPHAs to consider the spread of COVID-19 within schools and the broader community in deciding to temporarily return to comprehensive distance learning. If there are cases in 2 or more cohorts without an identified common exposure, school officials should discuss with LPHAs to determine if this represents unexplained spread within the school or broader community. And it's encouraged that the school follow recommendations from their LPHA on whether a temporary transition away from any in-person instruction for 2 weeks or longer is recommended to protect the health and safety of the students, staff, families, and the broader community. So hopefully you're seeing a larger trend here in the way that consultation and collaboration with LPHAs, as well as really strong judgment and discernment in terms of where, what instructional model to operate under is really a critical thread that runs through much of the counsel and advice we're providing today. Next slide, please. All right, that's all of them. So we've got 20 minutes left, which is a beautiful amount of time. And I know I've done a lot of talking, so I apologize. You've had just nothing but my voice to listen to, which gets a little monotonous. So thanks for your patient listening. Looking for themes in the chat that might warrant more conversation or a deeper dive. Alexa or Shandine, any to bring forward?
I think there's a tension between what's required and what's a mandate, so I think I can go back and kind of read the exact question, but that was something that was brought up a couple times. And so I'll look for the question here for a second. I've got to scroll back up.
I think that the gist is like, to what degree are schools required to enforce? So if we're saying, if a kid travels, when they come back, if a screening question is, have you traveled? Well, then you got to self-quarantine, right? We're saying no, schools, the student, upon disclosing that they've traveled, no, they can't be on site for 14 days. And so it's that, I think you're accurate in saying it's I don't know how to say it well. It's semantics. So like, does the 2-week freeze directly impact schools? It's like a yes and no. Yes, in this big implementation regard, and no in the you can still continue your instructional model that you've been using. And so I think the tension lies right in there. And so not trying to absolve or abdicate responsibility on the words of required, should, and recommend, but it's just not that clean.
Yeah, and I think that's really helpful, Shandine. I also think broad picture, anytime we can zoom out and remember that the extent to which you are able to help reinforce the students, especially if you're on site or hybrid, or if you have students coming for limited in person, anything that you can do as a school or a district to ensure that students and families and staff are following the 14-day quarantine will only help you continue to operate in the model that you're operating under. So in some ways, it's like what you do in the short term really helps what you are able to do in the long term. So it's another way to think about it. I know some people have been a little exasperated, like this is one more thing that we have to implement and pay attention to. And on one hand, yes, we hear that and we understand that. On the other hand, what it does is it asks us to say, we're trying to put as much protective behavior around one another as possible to mitigate spread and keep schools a safe place for learning. Again, that's particularly for those that are operating in person. Shandine?
Yeah, just also with regard to the test, I'm trying to get the OHA absolute stamp on it, but I feel pretty confident that the onset of COVID is up to 14 days. And so a negative test result's not going to shorten that quarantine. I'm fairly confident it's going to come back as 14. I'm sort of hedging a little bit because I want to triple check that because it's a major one, but that's what we've been saying this whole time. And so there's nothing about it that makes me think that's going to change, that a negative test is going to be an automatic, all right, then kid and staff can come back on site. But I will chase it. I will chase that.
I asked that question today to our local public health authority, and that was their response as well, that a negative test upon returning isn't sufficient, that you really do have to have that 14-day quarantine period.
Thanks, Penny. I appreciate it. So let's go with that answer as the given for right now. I will confirm it with OHA if otherwise, and get the message back out through the reopening advisors.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I have a good question that came to me in the private chat that I'm going to read out loud because I think it's really helpful for everybody. I have a student coming in from Kansas on Thursday. Am I to tell the parent that the child is not allowed to return to school for 14 days upon returning and provide classwork for the student for the 2 weeks? Do I get to count her as attending during this 14 days on my attendance? So Shandine and Dan and Alexa and others that are on the call with me help shape my answer if there's part of this that needs to be corrected. But what I would say is absolutely that we are under the governor's order, and that does include self-quarantine for non-essential travel. So accordingly, you would make accommodations for this child to engage in comprehensive distance learning for the next 14 days. And hopefully the child is well and feeling well and can be fully present and engaged in those 14 days. So you would mark that child as present as you would for any student participating in comprehensive distance learning. So hopefully that answered your question.
Samuel, several others have raised a question about authority and that they're getting pressure to wait until they get the governor's order out, like in their hands, in order before they move on things like leave and pay. And so I will follow up the second I've got something for you specifically on that I know that you will need to use with your staff.
Yeah, that makes really good sense. Appreciate the question, Sam, and others. All right, any other trends or questions we should address specifically from the chat?
There were a couple questions that came in earlier about how can we do limited in-person instruction even if we're in the red? And I think we answered those in here, that limited in-person instruction can still continue. And part of the reason of why that's different than the 6-person gathering is just, even with limited in person, you have the blueprint, you have strict protocols that would be different than in that, a social gathering. And that's where a lot of the spread is happening. So I think that one got answered. I'm not seeing anything else. Glenn just put a question there. If we have to pay a teacher 14 days quarantine, can we then require they not travel and put us in that position? And I think that's working within your local district.
Yeah, I think, Glenn, I appreciate that question. I think that's a local bargaining determination and question. Oh, are you coming? You're in a private school context?
Correct.
Yeah, if you're in a private school context, I think it's a decision. I don't know if you operate with a board or what your governing body is, but I would say then it's a decision up to whoever holds authority and leadership within your private school context.
Thank you. I think there's also a legal question that's a little bit difficult.
Yes, I think anytime, I think any of these related to staffing, anytime you can consult with legal counsel, that's always, just makes for the most comprehensive decisions.
Jen?
Yeah.
Hi. So I sent this message to Nancy Hungerford this morning to try to get some clarification. And at this point, it's not a mandate, or at least in her eyes, this was not a mandate from the governor. It was a recommendation, and that if staff were to leave and self-quarantine, it would be it would not qualify under the COVID Leave Act, but then it would be, at that point, it would be unpaid because they're not sick, so it wouldn't be sick leave. But it would also not qualify because it is not a mandate or a policy right now if they were to leave. And so that was her recommendation this morning. So because there is nothing, in her eyes, it's a recommendation, but it is not a policy at this point. And so if staff were to leave the state and return and elect to self-quarantine, it would be unpaid leave because it's not qualified under the Family First Act, and it's also not sick leave. So it would have to be unpaid at that point.
I'm just going to add, it would be great to see ODE or somebody put that in writing.
It would be.
Yeah, Casey, absolutely appreciate that insight. And I think it probably relates to what's going to be in the governor's executive order. But I certainly would say that you're in probably a good place as a district if that's the counsel and guidance you've been given today by your attorneys. Certainly to work with your union and think about how you might want to put that preliminary communication out there, given all the planning that's often involved with holiday travel, just so staff can begin to anticipate that and understand that we'll be finalizing more information as we receive it. But that certainly might be something you choose to share with staff in a preliminary communication, if that indeed is the direction that your district is being counseled to go. Lexi's asking, do we know when the executive order is going to be released? So thank you. And Russell, yes, is echoing an executive order would be helpful. So again, we're working in really careful, direct and immediate consultation with colleagues at OHA. Shandine and I don't have the answer to that in the immediate, but we certainly are working hard to get an answer for that question. Also question, I see KT here. KT, I don't want you to put you on the spot at all, but I know that we've been told that guidance around athletics is forthcoming this week. Do you happen to have, I'm getting lots of private chats with this question around when specifically will further guidance from OHA and OSAA be released?
So we're waiting for the clarifications that were specified when the governor made her announcement last Friday regarding that K-12 school guidance and sports guidance remains the same. So, and there might be further clarifications coming from that. That's our understanding. So as soon as we have those, we would send those out to schools, but we don't have those clarifications at this time.
Thank you, KT, appreciation and understood as well that when these things, when announcements like Friday's announcement happen and we're still getting information, we recognize that puts you in a difficult place because you're having to lead now and respond now to questions. And so just compassion and appreciation for how fast this all happens, and appreciate, again, your willingness to stay in the conversation with us as we work in consultation with other agencies and entities to get just the right information to you. And we know that some of the questions that are lingering are really critical and important. KT, did you want to say something else?
Absolutely. I was just going to say a lot of ADs have reached out to us today as well, looking for those clarifications. So as soon as we have them, we will definitely get them out to schools. So, but we don't have those. So, but yes, we appreciate everybody including us in this conversation as well and being a part of this. So thank you.
All right, so hopefully we did, it looks like from the chat, if I am paying attention and culling the right things from it, looks like we were able to answer lots of people's questions. Our hope is that you were able to either hear information again that you've heard on Friday or read about over the weekend, and that it was helpful to hear again. We know that anytime there's new announcement, it takes a while to adjust and make sense of it and hold it and understand it and be able to operationalize it. So we appreciate everyone's good effort and energy and intention We also recognize that, it takes a lot to continue to show up and lead through this and to bring a spirit of possibility and hope to people during what increasingly feels like, we're, a good friend of mine was talking about like the emotional tunnel. We get, in this place where it can get pretty dark. And so we know that as leaders, we get in those emotional tunnels too. And just encouragement to care for yourself and care for others through this, because we know that, this 2-week freeze, while necessary and important, is also raising some people's anxiety and just contributing to a sense of isolation for many people, ourselves included. So just know that we feel that, and we appreciate just the incredible amount of perseverance that it takes to continue to lead in the context we're in.
I think too, just appreciation for Jennifer's framing of that, because it's not like we're coming at it with this compartmentalized lens of, oh, the freeze and what can I do for students and families. It's impacting us and our ability to see our sisters, brothers, and then we got to help our families navigate that. And then we got to shift. Wait, it was pause, it's freeze. My son is like, what's the next label they're going to give it? How are you keeping up? What is that? And so like, there's no way to compartmentalize that reaction. And so really, really, just if you wanted to see behind the curtain, use that COVID inbox. We have resolve and reroute meetings twice a week for an hour, sometimes an hour and a half, where we go through every single question, make sure we're aligning it to get that answer out as quickly as we can, because we want to be of service to you. And we know that things are constantly changing. And we don't like that constant changing either, but we really want to be of service, because as fast as the questions are coming in to us, we know it's triple that to you all. So please do not hesitate to use that ODE COVID-19 email address. We've got a whole team that's working on those questions around the clock.
Absolutely. Thank you, Shondine. We also know, I certainly want to highlight and name and put out there that we know that many of you are also really challenged right now with trying to figure out how to help students in your high schools remain credit proficient, and to ensure that they're having success in comprehensive distance learning. And we know for sure that this is something heavy on your hearts and minds. So we are putting together, we're getting more information, number one, working with our high school success team at ODE and many of you, to just get some more data so we get better information around this, because as you know, our 9th grade on track data is, once it comes to us, is essentially a look back at the year previous. So we're trying hard to get some further data to really inform us to the extent of this issue statewide. If you have a real interest or passion and or a solution or some ideas of what could be a strategy going forward, and would like to join a listening group and potential like a little advisory team around this topic, please don't hesitate to put your name in the chat, or you can private message myself or Alexa Pearson, because we're really looking to get some thought partnership around the table so that we can be responsive to that question and need. Also, if you have a special topic or something that you would really appreciate hearing next week, please don't hesitate to let us know, because to the extent a theme shows up this week that we will focus on next week, we want to be reflective of what's up front for you. And also just a reminder that oftentimes we don't even know what the week's going to hold. So last Monday, when we presented office hours, we did not know that the governor was going to be making this move. So like you and alongside you, we also are responding in the moment, learning in the moment, and doing our best to be as responsive as possible. All right, we'll stay on for one more minute. Thank you again, everybody. Please take care of yourselves, and thank you for your time and shared inquiry.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Jennifer. We got Brandy, Angie, and Sue.